the dust of Mesopotamia, archaeologists dug up something buried that nobody can explain to this day. A handbag carved into stone, carried by the gods themselves. Then that exact same symbol turned up across the Atlantic in Mexico, buried at a site that predates the last ice age. That is not supposed to be possible. And here is the part almost nobody talks about. The bag itself was never the real mystery. The actual secret is what was sitting inside it. What they just found inside it is powerful enough to tear apart everything we have ever been taught. The handbag of the gods. Nobody told you what was under the floors where they found those mysterious bags. That is the part the museums leave out. You can walk through any major archaeology collection, stand in front of the towering carvings of winged figures holding those same bags, read the label that calls them ritual purification vessels, and walk away thinking you understood something. Not really, because the real story is not on the walls. It is underneath them. Look closely at what those carvings are actually holding. A rigid boxy container with a curved handle on top. Researchers call it a situla. Online it has a simpler name, the handbag of the gods. Whatever you call it, it is the same object. When archaeologists dug through the ruins of ancient Assyrian palaces and houses in Mesopotamia, they found something that stopped them cold. Buried under the floors, sealed under the thresholds, packed into brick boxes and pushed deep into the foundations of doorways and walls were clay figurines. Dozens of them at every single site, fish-headed, bird-headed, winged. And every single one of them was holding that same bag. Now look up at the walls of the palace of King Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, in what is now northern Iraq. This king ruled around 3,000 years ago, and he was one of the most feared men who ever lived. His palace walls were lined with stone panels 9 feet tall. Carved into every single one of those panels were the same repeating figures. Some had the heads of fish, others had the heads of birds, some had wings. These beings were called Apkallu, ancient Mesopotamian sages believed to have brought wisdom and knowledge to humanity before the Great Flood. Every single carving held the exact same object in its right hand, a bag with the exact same shape, and everyone stared straight out at anyone who walked through the door. The Apkallu were semi-divine beings who survived the Great Flood that destroyed the rest of humanity. And they were the ones who brought civilization to the people who came after. They brought writing. They brought farming. They brought law. They brought architecture. They handed humanity all of it. And in every single carving of them doing it, they are holding that same bag. The same beings. The same bag. In both places at once. Here is the question nobody asks. Why both? When you want to display power, you carve it into a wall where everyone can see it. That makes sense. That is what powerful people do. But when you bury something in a sealed box under a threshold, you are not displaying it. You are anchoring it. You are making sure it cannot cross that line. You are pinning it in place. The Sumerians had one word that covered every kind of spirit like this, protective or destructive, and that word was udug. When the Akkadians borrowed the word, it became utuku. This same word described two completely opposite outcomes. The word could mean a being that protected an entire household from death, from sudden illness, from disaster striking in the night. The same word could also mean a being that destroyed that same household completely, killing the people inside it and leaving nothing standing. There was no separate word for the dangerous version. Out of every spirit covered by that one word, the Apkallu were the most powerful version, and nobody inside that house could look at one and know which outcome they were going to get. The only thing that decided the outcome was whether a trained priest performed every part of the ritual correctly. The priest had to speak every word of the incantation exactly as it was written, with no mistakes. The priest had to place a small clay figurine of the Apkallu in the exact location the ritual text demanded, down to the precise spot in the room. The priest had to make sure the seal on the buried figurine stayed completely intact and was never broken open. If the priest got any part of this wrong, The same creature that was supposed to protect the family from death and sickness could instead become the thing that killed them. Now picture what this meant for the king sleeping inside that palace every single night. The creature carved 9 feet tall outside his bedroom door was not guaranteed to be protecting him. That creature was one mispronounced word, one misplaced figurine, or one broken seal away from becoming the exact thing that killed him in his sleep. The bag in its hand did not prove the creature was safe. The bag was the only thing standing between the king staying alive and the king dying, and that only worked if every single part of that ritual had been done perfectly. The ritual texts also gave exact instructions for what to do if one of those sealed boxes accidentally broke open during later construction work. These instructions were urgent. They meant calling in an exorcist immediately. Think about what that actually means. The most powerful empire in the ancient world, a civilization that conquered nations and built palaces that made grown men weep, was so deeply terrified of accidentally cracking open a small clay figurine buried under a floor that they kept a trained exorcist on standby specifically for that moment. What exactly did they think was going to come out? What was it doing down there, alone, for 1,000 years, that needed to be sealed shut and never checked on? Now, go back 8,500 years before any of this. On a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey, a different group of people had already found that exact same bag, and what they did with it was far worse. The burial was a sealing, not a memorial. 8,500 years before the Assyrians built Nimrud, on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey at the very end of the last ice age, a different group of people was carving that exact same bag into the most important stone they ever built, Gobekli Tepe. On Pillar 43, the most heavily decorated stone at the entire site, are 3 rigid containers with curved handles. The same bag, carved into stone 11,500 years ago. The Assyrians who carved their version into the palace walls at Nimrud would not exist for another 8,500 years. The civilization that produced the world's first cities, the world's first writing, had not begun yet. Nothing we recognize as human civilization had begun yet. And the bag was already there, buried along with everything. The comfortable version says they buried it to protect it, a gift to the future. But that version falls apart the moment you look at what they buried it with. They built a temple around it. The largest and most complex sacred structure that had ever existed on Earth at that point in human history. And inside that temple, someone stripped the flesh from 3 human skulls and went to work on the bone. They took a sharp flint blade and carved deep grooves straight across the forehead again and again until the cuts ran deep enough to hold something steady. Then they drilled a hole clean through the top of one skull. A cord went through that hole. The grooves kept the cord from slipping, and that skull hung there in the dark of that temple, swinging slightly, facing forward for whoever it was facing. Then they buried it all. The bag, the temple, the hanging skull, sealed it under the ground so completely that the world forgot it had ever existed for 11,000 years. They did not want it found. They wanted it gone. These were not the actions of people performing a simple burial. These were the actions of people doing something that required complete commitment to whatever was happening inside that temple while the bag watched from above. Look back at Pillar 43 again. The same stone with the handbag shapes carved at the top has, carved at the bottom, a headless human figure. One arm raised, no head, on the same pillar as the bag. And elsewhere at the site, archaeologists found a small stone sculpture of a figure holding a severed human head in its hands, and a separate, decapitated, human statue. 691 pieces of human bone have been recovered from that fill. Fragments mixed into the debris that was packed down on top of the bag to bury it for good. Whatever ritual produced those fragments, the people who closed this place down chose to seal the evidence of it in the same ground as the symbol they were burying. And nobody knows what made them stop. Gobekli Tepe ran for 16 centuries and then, all at once, In a single coordinated effort that took real organized labor to complete, an entire community decided the bag needed to go underground and stay there, and packed the evidence of whatever had been happening to human skulls and human bones in around it as they did it. No disaster layer, no sign of war, just the decision. Final. Now, let's look at what we have so far. The Assyrians carved the bag onto 9-foot stone walls and also buried the exact same symbol in sealed brick boxes under their floors, calling in an exorcist anytime one of those boxes cracked open. The people of Gobekli Tepe carved the same bag above everything else in their most sacred temple, and then buried the entire building and the bag inside it, under hundreds of pieces of human bone and skulls drilled for hanging. Two civilizations, 8,500 years apart. Both encountered this exact object, and both of them, independently with no contact with each other, decided the right response was to bury it and make absolutely sure it could not easily come back out. The Assyrians were afraid of what happened if the seal broke. The people of Gobekli Tepe were afraid of something that had already happened inside, while the bag sat above them on the stone. What was in it that made both of them that afraid? The answer to what is inside is darker than either of those civilizations wanted anyone to know. What was in the bag? There are 4 major theories about what was inside that strange bag. None of them has been proven. But every one of them tries to answer questions that archaeologists are still arguing about today. And if even one of them were true, the story of human civilization would become much darker than most people have ever imagined. The first theory begins with a question. How did farming appear across different parts of the ancient world within roughly the same broad period? People separated by thousands of miles, people who spoke different languages. Yet somehow they all made the same astonishing leap. They stopped wandering, they settled down, they planted crops, they built villages, then civilizations. Was it simply coincidence? Supporters of this theory don't think so. They believe the bag wasn't a religious symbol at all. They argue it was carrying something. Seeds, knowledge, the instructions for rebuilding civilization after the last ice age. Think about what that would mean. If someone handed your ancestors the knowledge that kept them alive, who was really in control? Who decided what was planted? Who decided who survived the next winter, and who didn't? Imagine being the first family to receive that knowledge. You don't know where it came from. You don't know who brought it. You only know one thing. Without it, your children may not live long enough to see another harvest. Is that really a gift? Or is it dependence from the very beginning? And if the harvest failed, if the seeds didn't grow, if an entire village slowly starved to death, who would those frightened people blame? The weather? Themselves? Or the mysterious beings who arrived carrying a bag that seemed to decide whether life continued or ended? The second theory is even harder to shake off. Look at Gobekli Tepe. Some of those stone pillars weigh up to 50 tons. How did people who had no metal tools, no cranes, no engines, and no wheels quarry those stones, drag them across the ground, lift them into the air, and place them with astonishing precision? Many believe the bag was some kind of device, something that temporarily gave ordinary people strength they should never have possessed. Think about what that would look like. Imagine a man putting his hands under a stone that should crush him. For a moment, it moves. Then the strength disappears just because the bag fails. The stone comes crashing back down. How many men died before one pillar finally stood upright? How many sons were buried beneath the very monument they were trying to build? Excavations at Gobekli Tepe have uncovered hundreds of human bone fragments. Supporters of this theory ask a chilling question. What if some of those people weren't simply builders? What if they were the price? What if every pillar standing today cost lives nobody ever wrote down? The third theory is the one that unsettles people the most, because this time, the bag isn't changing the world around us. It's changing us. Something extraordinary happened in human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors made only gradual changes to their tools. Then, within a relatively short span in evolutionary terms, everything accelerated. Art appeared, complex symbols appeared, long-distance trade expanded, monuments rose. Why? Supporters of this theory believe the answer wasn't simply time. They believe something changed the human mind. Look closely at the ancient carvings. Again and again, the strange figure presses what looks like a pine cone toward a human being. Not toward the ground, not toward an animal, toward a person. Some people have noticed something unusual. The pine cone the strange figure is holding looks remarkably similar to the pineal gland, a tiny organ buried deep in the center of the human brain. That small gland helps regulate our sleep and our body's internal clock. For centuries, many spiritual traditions have also described it as the place connected to higher awareness or consciousness, although that idea is not accepted scientific fact. Supporters of this theory believe that similarity is no accident. They argue the carvings are showing something being done to the human mind itself, not teaching, not speaking, changing. Imagine standing in front of a being your entire culture believes has power beyond anything you've ever seen. It reaches toward your head. You don't know what it's doing. You don't know what is about to change. You can't stop it. You can't even ask it to stop. If this theory were true, the carvings wouldn't be showing a blessing. They would be showing the moment human beings were changed, the moment people began thinking differently, learning differently, creating differently. And if that change really happened, every child born after that would simply inherit it, never knowing that the human mind might once have been very different. Then comes the fourth theory. This is the one people struggle to forget, because it doesn't stop with one person. It reaches everyone. Supporters of this theory argue the bag didn't work by touching people one at a time. They imagine it affecting the space around it, just something capable of changing every human being nearby. Imagine standing in a crowd. You don't volunteer, you don't agree, you don't even know something is happening. Then your thoughts begin to change. The way you see the world changes. The way you solve problems changes. Without your permission, without your knowledge. If that sounds impossible, ask yourself another question. If something had the power to change the human mind, who decided when to use it? Who decided who received it? And who decided who didn't? Whether any of these theories are true remains completely unproven. But they all begin with the same unsettling question. Why does this strange bag appear over and over again in the hands of the same mysterious figures? Whatever those ancient artists believed it represented, they clearly thought it was important enough to carve into stone again. And again and again. What makes it all so mysterious is the disappearance. Why it disappeared? The handbag symbol dominated the sacred art of every civilization that carried it for thousands of years. And then in roughly the same historical window, as the great monotheistic religions rose to power and the classical period began, it vanished from public religious art across multiple cultures almost simultaneously. You do not accidentally lose something that important. Something that was everywhere for that long does not just quietly disappear. It gets removed, and removal requires a decision, and decisions require a reason. There are two theories about what that reason was. The first is the simplest. The beings who carried the bag finished what they came to do. They gave humanity the push it needed, the seeds, the knowledge, the upgrade. Whatever was in that container got delivered, and then they left and took their technology with them. The carvings stayed because stone outlasts everything. But the actual objects, the actual devices, walked out with the beings who carried them and did not come back. This theory explains the timing cleanly. The symbol fades as the direct memory of the beings who carried it fades. Each generation gets further from the original encounter. The ritual becomes a habit. The habit becomes a symbol. The symbol becomes decoration. And eventually, even the decoration stops because nobody alive remembers what it actually was. That is the gentle version. The second theory is darker. The technology did not leave, it was taken, hidden deliberately by the institutions that were rising to power in exactly the same historical window when the symbol disappeared. Institutions whose entire authority depended on a very specific version of where civilization came from. And that version had absolutely no room in it for non-human beings arriving from outside with bags full of power that they handed to humanity. Think about what the Apkallu story actually says. Non-human beings came from the water. They taught us everything: writing, law, agriculture, architecture. Everything that makes civilization possible came from them and what they carried. Now think about what the rising monotheistic traditions needed people to believe: that one God created humanity, that civilization developed because of divine will working through human hands, that the source of all knowledge and power flows through a specific religious authority and nowhere else. Those two stories cannot both be true at the same time. One of them had to go. And the Apkallu story was thousands of years older. But the monotheistic traditions had something the Apkallu story did not. They had institutional power, armies, governments, the ability to decide what got carved into new buildings and what got quietly erased from the ones being torn down. The process by which early Christianity absorbed and replaced older symbols is documented and has a name: Interpretatio Christiana. The Church did not destroy old symbols. It kept them and stripped them of their original meaning and gave them new Christian stories. The pine cone is sitting in Vatican City right now in a courtyard that bears its name. A 4-meter-tall bronze sculpture that originally stood at the Temple of Isis in Rome. Moved to St. Peter's Basilica in the early Middle Ages. Moved again to the Vatican Museums in 1608, where it has stayed ever since. The institution that replaced the old religion kept the most powerful symbol of that old religion in its most prominent courtyard. Not as worship, as a trophy, as a statement that whatever that symbol once meant, the people who held it now were the ones standing in this courtyard. And the beings who originally carried the bag were not just forgotten. They were actively rebranded. The Apkallu, the bringers of wisdom and civilization, were reclassified by the rising traditions as demons, as fallen angels, as forbidden figures whose knowledge was dangerous and whose symbols were to be avoided. The knowledge they brought was called forbidden knowledge. The symbol of their power was called pagan decoration. For over 1,000 years, the world was told that what those 9-foot figures carried on their walls and buried under their floors was a bucket of holy water. Then someone dug up Gobekli Tepe, and the question that 1,000 years of institutional power had worked very hard to bury came straight back up through the ground with it. The warning in the stone. Everything covered so far assumes the handbag was a gift, that the beings who carried it came with good intentions, that they looked at struggling humanity and felt something close to generosity, that the knowledge inside that rigid container with the curved handle was handed over freely to help us grow into something better than what we were. But there is one more theory, and it is the one that makes everything that came before it look completely different. What if the handbag was not a gift at all? What if it was the most important warning in human history? And what if we have been staring at it carved into stone on multiple continents for 12,000 years without understanding what it was actually trying to tell us? Look at the pattern one more time. The handbag appears at the very beginning of every civilization we know of. Gobekli Tepe, Mesopotamia, Olmec, Mexico, always at the foundation, always in the hands of a divine figure who arrived from outside and handed humanity the tools to build something new, and then it disappears. Every time. Before the civilization that received it reaches its peak, the bag comes first, and then it vanishes. And then the civilization that held it either collapses or transforms so completely it becomes unrecognizable. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns have sources. Now look at what was happening 12,800 years ago. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis says a fragmented comet struck the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago. It triggered a cooling period that lasted 1,200 years. It contributed to the extinction of multiple large animal species across the entire planet. It devastated human populations on multiple continents simultaneously. And it happened at almost exactly the same moment that Gobekli Tepe was being built. At exactly the moment the handbag first appears in the archaeological record. If a technologically advanced civilization existed before that impact and was destroyed by it, the survivors would have faced one specific and desperate problem. How do you preserve the knowledge of an advanced civilization when everything is gone? When your cities are ash? When your libraries are rubble? When the people who understood how everything worked are dead or dying in the cold? You cannot rebuild complex technology from scratch in one generation. You cannot write it down if your writing system no longer exists, but you can carve the most important thing into stone. You can carve it everywhere you go, on every sacred site you build, in every culture you reach as you travel across a broken world trying to restart what was lost. The handbag carved into the most permanent material available on every inhabited continent is exactly what a civilization's final message looks like. But here is the question that changes everything. What if the survivors were not just trying to pass the knowledge on? What if they were trying to pass a warning about it? Because the Oan's legend says something specific that nobody talks about. After he finished teaching humanity everything necessary for civilization, the ancient texts record that nothing material was ever added by way of improvement to his instructions. That is a strange line for a generous teacher. Like the instructions were complete and deliberately incomplete at the same time. Like the beings who carried the knowledge knew exactly how much was safe to give, and were absolutely not going to give one single thing beyond that line. You do not carefully limit what you give someone unless you have already seen what happens when someone gets too much. The technology inside the handbag was powerful enough to build Gobekli Tepe, powerful enough to move 50-ton stones, powerful enough to restart agriculture across multiple continents simultaneously. That kind of power does not just build things, it ends them. The survivors did not carve the handbag into stone on every continent as a celebration. They carved it as a record. This is what we had. This is what we did with it. This is what happened to us. And they placed it at the top of the most important stone, above the animals, above the birds, above the headless human figure at the bottom of the same pillar, above everything. Because whatever the bag represented, the cost of it was the most important thing they needed the next cycle of humanity to understand. Right now, the actual physical vessels, the real objects that match those carvings, are sitting in museum display cases in New York and London labeled ritual purification buckets. Nobody has tested them for radiation. Nobody has checked them for unknown elements or any physical signature of what the evidence suggests they once contained. The answer to what was inside the handbag of the gods might be sitting under fluorescent lights behind a velvet rope right now, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The beings who carried it knew what it could do. 2 civilizations buried it because of what it did, and the warning they left is carved into stone on every continent on Earth. We just have to decide if we actually want to know what it says.